Hey guys, this is Mitch with Fine Point CGI, and today we're going to build a flexible crafting system inside of Godot. So we're going to go through and plan it all out. We're going to set up our inventory buttons to be more flexible. We're going to set up our items to actually be a bit more flexible as well, and it's going to have the ability to craft a button. And then finally, we're going to go through and clean up a bunch of code because a lot of this code, as always, is not fully thought through. So a lot of times you're going to have to make some adjustments and pivot as you go to make your code more flexible. So that's what I have in store for you guys today. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we have to talk about is how we're going to change our actual design here. So I've kind of gone through and already changed it so that way I can just kind of run it through for you guys. So first things first, we're gonna have to add a can afford. So basically the idea is that we're going to check if we can afford an item, and if we can't, then we're just gonna return false here. But if we can, we're gonna filter our items, then we're gonna check our quantity is over a required amount, and then if it is, then we're gonna return true and say, yeah, we can afford that. And if not, then of course we'll return false. We'll say, hey, we can't afford this, so it's not gonna happen. Now, if we head over here, once we can afford an item in our inventory, then we can remove those items. So you can see that we'll check if we can afford it. So that way we don't remove something that doesn't exist. We'll get all the items of that type. We'll get an item from a list, because what's going to happen is it's going to return a list of items that have those things, because it's possible you could have 2 or 3 stacks of an item. Then we're going to remove that quantity of the item. If the quantity left is 0, we're going to remove it, and then we'll reflow our buttons. And then if the quantity that is remaining is 0, then we will return successful. If not, then we will attempt to pull again from our list, and we'll loop through this until all of the items in our list are completed. And as long as our can afford is correct, we should be okay with just running through this code without error checking, because we've already done our error checking above, so we should be okay. Now over here in our inventory class list, we basically are going to be adding in the states. That's going to be new because we're going to need to be able to actually check what our state is. And we're going to have to set up a current state system as well. That way we know if we're crafting or if we're not crafting. Because if we're crafting, our code's going to have to react a little bit differently than if our state is not. And also, it's a good idea to always have a global state of what your inventory is sitting at. So that way you're not doing something that you shouldn't be doing. Now, once we have that, let's take a look at our inventory button. So if you remember, we had an inventory button. You can see we have added a inventory button state and a current state. That's going to allow us to have one button that does 2 things or 3 things. In our case, it's going to basically check to see what the state is. And if the state is inventory, then it's going to use that item. If it's not, then it's going to craft that item. That way we can use the same button for 2 different interactions without needing to recode additional things. Now, I know we could use inheritance to do this, but really it's a tiny change, so I'm okay with just adjusting it slightly. So basically what we'll do is we'll add in a state check here to use the item or craft the item. We'll also do the same thing with our setup button. If our state is crafting our inventory, we'll set our state to crafting our inventory. And then if we update our button, we basically will be setting our icon, setting our quantity, setting our text, and then ending from there. And that's basically the gist of what our inventory button is going to do. Now, in terms of our item, because we have to have an item to actually make this work, we need to adjust our item to actually add in a list of items that make this into an item. And actually, I actually don't think I have it in here. So let's add that. So let me click on this guy. There we go. So we'll add item craft makeup, which will be a list of items, and we'll want to add a few functions. One will be can craft item, which basically just says for all items in item makeup, we will go ahead and check to see if our inventory can afford it. If it can, return true. If not, return false. And then that kind of leads into our craft item. So first what we'll do is we'll get our list of items. Then we're going to run through those items and verify if we can afford them. If we can afford all of them, then we will remove the items from the inventory, add the actual crafted item, and then we will return true. If we can't afford them, then we will return false. And that's basically how that's going to work. Now, in terms of design, what I'm thinking is something kind of like this. So we'll have a button here will have a craft amount and a name. So we can basically say you can craft 100 of these, one of these, things like that. And they'll have the name underneath them. So that's kind of what I think we're going to go about and do. So hopefully this gives you kind of an idea of how we're going to approach our crafting menu. And let's go ahead and build this. All right. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually set up our crafting menu. So we'll go into our scene, new scene here, and we will make a user interface. Now, our user interface is going to be relatively simple to build. All we're going to have is we're going to have a small, basically square here. So we'll drag this guy to be about this big, give or take. We'll put him over here, and we will right click, add in a panel, because we're going to need a background here. So we'll make that full rect. So we have a nice background, and then we're going to right click our control node, add a child node, add in a grid container, and we are also going to make that full rect, and that's going to hold all of our buttons. Now it's pretty much exactly how we have our actual inventory set up as well. So it should be relatively simple. Now, if we head into our grid container here and we take a look at our layout, you'll notice that we have a custom minimum size. I'm going to set that to 40 and 40, which is the exact same size that we set up our previous one as well. So basically our inventory and our grid container are very, very similar in setup. Now we also can come into our theme override, go into our constraints, set our H separate and our V separate to 5, which is what we had our previous one set to. So that way we just have everything kind of consistent here. Once we have that, we're going to go ahead and go up to our control node. Let's name that crafting menu. Let's right click, attach a script, and let's name it crafting menu.gd. No space in between because Godot doesn't really like spaces. And we will click create. Now, this crafting menu is going to be relatively simple. Basically, all we need is to have an array of items that we are going to populate with. So that array of items is going to house all of our craftable items that are in the game. So basically, it could be as many as we want or as little as we want. But remember that if we go above a certain amount, we are going to need to add a scrollable container. So that's something to keep in mind. And it's completely up to you on if you want to add that. Also, we're going to need to have some kind of button that we're going to be able to instance. And then we need to be able to instance those buttons. So first things first, we're going to hit export var craftable items. And we're going to make that a type array. Like that. Then we're also going to have an export var craftable button, and we're going to make that a type packed scene like that. And now we just need to be able to make it so we can actually add our items. And it's actually going to be really easy because once we instance our craft menu, we'll just basically loop through our items and then basically just add them. So we'll say for item in craftable items, then we can just add our item. Now you'll notice that that's going to throw a fit, right? It's going to get mad at us. Hey, function add is not found in base self. That's because we actually don't have an add function. So I'm going to get rid of my process function. I'm going to add that. So func add, and we're going to type in item : item, and that's going to make that a type item. Now our func item is basically just a function that will be setting up our actual items. So we're going to be looping through and instancing them, right? So first we need to instance our craft button. So var craft current craft button is equal to craftable button dot instantiate, like so. And then we need to basically add it as a child. So $grid container dot add child, and we will add our current craft button. Now this is great, but we actually need to set up our button. So what are we going to use for our button, right? Well, we have a craftable button, but how are we going to use it? Well, that's where the inventory button comes in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reuse our inventory button here as our craftable button. We talked about this in the planning section of the tutorial where I said, hey, here's kind of what I'm thinking, right? Where we're going to have the two states and we're going to have like a state machine almost, right? That kind of determines how this button gets operated. Well, that's basically how we're going to handle it here. First thing we need to do is we need to actually create our button state. So we'll say enum inventory button state. And then we can basically just type inventory, comma, craftable. And then basically it's as simple as coming down here, creating our state. So we'll say at export var current state, and we'll make that an inventory button. And we'll make that an inventory button state. So once we have our inventory button states, we basically need to set up our update item to allow for that state change, right? Because remember, we call update item to actually update our button. So we'll come in here, we'll hit comma, state, and we'll make that an inventory button states. And we'll come down here, and just after all of this, we'll come in and say self.current state is equal to state. And there we go. Now, something else that we're going to have to change is on our button click, we need to actually pass in our state. So we'll pass in state, and we'll come down here and we'll pass in our current state like that. And I think hopefully that should be everything that we need to change. Let's take a quick gander at it. State, current state. Yeah, that should be everything. And one last thing that we're going to have to do is we need to actually set this up to have a class name. So we'll say class underscore name, and we'll pass in inventory button. And the reason why we're doing this is so that way we can access our inventory button states by typing inventory button dot inventory button states dot craftable or inventory respectively. It's just going to make things a little bit easier, so that way we have some auto completion with our code. Now, once we have this, I'm going to hit Control S, and I'm going to save my crafting menu, and I'm going to go back to my crafting menu into our add functionality. Now, when we do our crafting button, we now know that this is an inventory button. So if you remember, we have an update item. So current craft button dot update item, like that. And then we'll pass in an item, comma, 0, comma, and then we have to pass in a state. So we can type inventory button dot inventory button states dot craftable. And that's how we can make this into a craftable button. So that's kind of the cool part, right? We can say, hey, there we go. We have a craftable button. And since we have that event that we built on our craftable button, if you remember, our inventory button actually has a on button click event. So we can basically just set that up. So we can come in here and type current craft button dot connect, and we'll connect our on button clicked, comma, and we'll pass it into something else. Now, down here, we're going to have to create a function to actually intercept that signal call. So we'll say on craft button click like that, and then we'll pass in our index, comma, item, comma, and state like that. And then we could just say dot item dot craft item like that. And we will call this function like that. Now you might be asking, okay, hold on a minute, Mitch. You just went through like a million things, and we don't have the ability to craft an item. And you are correct, right? We haven't hooked that up yet, but that's what we're going to do is basically whenever this button gets clicked, bam, we're going to throw out a craft item. And that should make things a little bit easier to work with. So to set up our item, we actually have to go out to our item itself. So let's head down to our add-ons, FPCGI, inventory system, scripts, and let's open up our item.gd. And here's our item.gd. Now, our item.gd will need quite a bit of changes. So if you remember from our design, we said, hey, we're going to have an item craftable makeup, which will be a dictionary of items. And then we're going to need to figure out if we can craft our item, and then we will need to craft our item all within this spot. If you remember, we have use item, right? So if we're in inventory mode, we use the item. If not, then we can craft that said item. So we'll come up here and we're going to make an item makeup, which will be our dictionary. So at export var item craftable makeup, and we'll make that a type dictionary. And I know what you might be asking. You should make a typed dictionary And unfortunately, in my testing, it didn't work. Though, if you guys have any suggestions, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to update this and make it a little bit better. But in the meantime, let's actually determine if we can actually craft this item. So we'll say func can craft item, and we'll make it return a Boolean like that. So first, when we do our can craft item, we need to go through and make sure that we can afford every element of our item. So that means we need to have a count of items that we can afford. So var count of afforded items, and we'll make that equal to 0. So that way it just kind of defaults to something. And then I'm going to say for item in item craftable makeup. Once we have this, we basically need to get some kind of reference to our inventory, because we have to say, hey, can I afford this? And I can't just say $ inventory because it's not directly under my stuff. Now I have two options. Basically, I can make the inventory a global parameter, or I can create some kind of group to check for that by saying, get tree.get group, right? But I think the best method is to come into my game manager here and actually create a reference to it. I think that'll be a lot easier and it makes things a little bit simpler. So I'm going to come up here and I'm just going to say, hey, var inventory. I'm going to make that a type inventory, which you'll notice does not work. And the reason why is because if we go to our inventory, we haven't actually set up a class name for that. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to type class name inventory. And then when I come in here, I could just make this a type inventory. And that will basically allow me to have all of the auto completion that I would expect, and it will just work. And we're going to need to set this on startup, right? Because we cannot just have this variable exist and not be set. So we'll come to our inventory, and on ready, we'll basically just set this up. So we'll say if game manager dot inventory dot is equal to null, then we'll set game manager dot inventory is equal to self. Else, if it already has been set, we really only want one reference. So we'll queue free that like that. And once we have this, we're going to have to make some more adjustments. So if you remember, we have our can afford right here, right? Func can afford item. With this, we basically need to also check how much of an item. Now, normally we handle this by item quantity, but since we are doing a craftable system, it could be that the amount that's in a stack or the amount that's existing currently is not the same amount that we would expect, if that makes sense. I know that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but basically I want to decouple the quantity from my actual required amount, because that's going to make things a little bit more flexible. So we'll say quantity, and we're going to make that a type int, and we'll set this equal to 0. So that's going to default it to 0. So if quantity is equal to 0, then we're going to want to set it to item.quantity like that. And I know what you're saying. Okay, hold on a minute, but why? Well, here's why. So basically, if we pass in a 0, there's no reason to run this function. That means that we are saying, can you afford nothing? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, if they pass in 0, then it must be just whatever my quantity is good. So we'll say quantity is equal to item quantity, like that. And then we could basically just come in here and change anything that's item quantity, like this guy here, to quantity. So we'll just copy this, we'll paste it, and we'll paste it. And that should be pretty much it. And I know that we're getting some red right here. That's because of our item script is not completed. So it's going to throw a fit because it thinks that we're not doing it correctly. Don't worry. It's totally fine. Now, something that we have to look at also is we are passing in our populate buttons item connected on click. If you remember, we actually changed this. it passes in 3 parameters now. So we'll just comma state, and there we go. And the reason why I'm doing the comma state is because we might not necessarily need it, just because we have the on button click current item, use item, and then we have the other one as well. But there might be plans in the future that we might want to use that state parameter. So I just want to have it there just in case. For instance, if we had a global thing where if we click on any inventory item or something like that, and we wanted to keep track of it or something, having that state parameter might be useful just in case. Now, once we have this, we can basically just go into our item and we can just check if we can afford it. So we'll say if game manager dot inventory dot can afford, we'll pass in our item, and we will pass in our item craftable makeup item. And you might be wondering, okay, hold on a minute. What does this mean? Well, our dictionary is going to be set up like this. It's going to have our item, and then it's going to have our required amount like that. So basically, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, can we afford this? We're going to pass in our item, so our actual item, and then we're going to pull back from our dictionary the required amount. And that's going to be set up what our amount actually is. And then we'll basically just count plus equals 1. And then we'll come down here and we'll say if count is greater than or equal to item craftable makeup dot size, like that, then return true. Else, we're going to go ahead and return false. Like that. And that'll basically set up our can craft item. Now you can see that we have count is not existent, and that's because it's count of affordable items. So we'll update those guys, and that should work. And now we just need to set up our craft items. So func craft items. And we'll basically say if can craft item for item in item craftable makeup, we basically need to remove our inventory item, right? So var success is equal to game manager dot inventory dot remove. And if we take a look at our inventory, you'll notice our remove function right here only takes in an item. Well, much like our can afford, where we had to adjust that to have that quantity, we're going to have to do the exact same thing here, right? We can't just pass in our item like that, because while that works in theory, it's not going to work in practice, because it's actually going to remove that item plus whatever its quantity amount is. So whatever you have your inventory item set up as with a default amount, that's going to affect how this works. So it could work if you wanted something like a one-to-one crafting system where you said these two items, quantity 1 makes this one item. But if you want to do additional items like 2 green herbs plus one red herb will make a super potion, right? You wouldn't want to just pass in 1 green herb, right? You'd want to pass in 2. So let's do that. So let's go to our inventory. Let's come in here, hit comma quantity colon int equals 0, like that. And then we'll basically do the exact same thing that we did with our can afford. We'll say if quantity is equal to 0, then our quantity is equal to our item dot quantity. That way we don't break any backwards compatibility, because one of the biggest problems that you're going to run into is backwards compatibility with your code. So you want to make sure that when you architect your code, you maintain that backwards compatibility constantly. So now all we have to do is come in here and update our stuff to work with quantity. So that's going to be something like if the current ID is ID, if current item quantity minus quantity is less than 0, then the current item quantity minus equals I quantity. That's fine. Else we're going to remove our quantity like that. And then we will come down here and do the same thing here. So we'll paste that guy in. And I think that will do it. This basically just removes buttons that have 0 quantity. So that way we know what this does. But basically that's what it does. It just removes that button and then gets rid of it. It culls it out of the system. So once we have this, we should be able to just go into our item.gd, comma, item craftable makeup, and then we can just pass in our item. Now, the whole idea of the system is that item craftable makeup has the item and the required amount. So this should, in theory, work. Now, it says invalid, expected at most 1, but received 2. Let's take a look at our inventory. No, that should be correct. So I think that Godot is just being dramatic here. I don't think it's figured itself out just yet. So we'll let that sit for a second. If not success, then print failed to remove item.name. Then basically we just have to add our inventory items. So game manager dot inventory, dot add self. Yeah, I think it's just being dramatic. I don't quite know why it's upset. So once we have this, we basically just have to finish setting up our crafting menu. So we'll click on our crafting menu. We'll go to our inspector. You can see that it says a crafting items and a craftable button. So I'm going to drag in a new button, and that should be my inventory button. So we'll come up here to our add-ons, FPCGI, inventory system, scenes, inventory button. We'll drag that guy in there, and now we have that attached. And let me see. I think we might be good to test this, though we do need to set up our craftable items. So let's take a look at what items we have. So it looks like we have a key.tscn. We have a key.tres. So maybe we could use our key and say that to make up a key, we can use 2 additional items. Now, I'm curious, if we look at our inventory, we add item and add item 2. What are those items that are being added? So if we head out to our inventory here and we look at our add item, we are adding keys, it looks like, and a chest combined. So I'm thinking that I'm going to change these to something else. What I'll do is I'm going to make 2 new items. So I'm going to right click my RES, new resource, and I'm going to choose resource, and it's going to let me save my resource. So I'm going to save it as iron.tres. I'll scroll down here to where my iron is, iron.tres. I'll double click on that. Click this guy open. We're going to change my ref script to my actual item script. So we'll come in here. We'll go into add-ons, FBCGI, scripts, and we will pass in item.gd. And here's going to be my item. I'll call it iron. And I will set this to 5. My resource path, I don't really have a resource path just yet, so we'll go ahead and keep that empty. I'm going to drag my Godot icon as Godot icon SVG. I'm going to set this to 1 and 1, and it's not stackable because I don't need that. We're not going to have any makeups because we don't need that, and we don't have any sub items or weight that's associated with that. And now I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to right click, new resource. I'm going to bring in a resource, and we are going to save it as coal. We'll say that coal and iron makes up a key, right? Because to me, that's simple enough. We'll double click on our coal. We will load in a script. We're going to go to add-ons, FPCGI, scripts, and item.gd. We'll open that up, and we will say coal. And I believe I said 5 for the previous one, so we'll go with 6. No resource path. Our icon will just be the Godot default icon here. We're going to set this to 1 and 1. No weight, no stackable, nothing special like that. And then if we click on our key, you can see our key has this right here. Its ID is 2. We'll come in here to item craftable makeup, and we're going to add in a new key. So if you remember, our key is an item. So we'll come in here. We'll set this to a object here. We're going to drag in our iron. So we'll find that. So we'll drag that guy in. And then we'll come down here and we need to set a new value. So we will set it to an integer, int, and we'll say we require one of these guys. We're going to add another key value pair. We're going to set this to an object. We will drag in our coal like so, and then we'll come down here. We'll make this an integer. We'll set this to 1 as well. So this is going to take 1 coal and 1 iron to create our object, if that makes sense. So now we need to go into our craft menu, and here you can see we have craftable items. So we'll go with 1. We'll make this into a type object like so, and then we're going to drag in our key right here. So now we have our key and we have our 2 components that make up that key. If you click on this, you can see we have those 2 components right here. So now we kind of have an idea of what this item is going to be, what this is actually going to be built out to be. Now I'm going to hit Control S and save. And then I'm going to go into my inventory. And instead of on button down key.tres, I'm going to say iron like so. I'm going to copy this and paste. And then I'm going to come in here. Instead of chest combined, we're going to say coal. And I will copy this guy as well and paste. And now, in theory, if I hit play, you'll see that our inventory is empty. I'm going to add an item. And we have a crash, so that's not a good sign. Invalid call update item expected 3 arguments. So you can see here, we are adding an item in, and it is not a craftable item. So we need to actually set the state. So we'll say inventory button dot inventory button state dot, and I believe this is going to be an inventory button. So there's that. We'll refresh this, and we will add an item, and we get nothing. So that's not a great sign. So we'll walk through this code a tiny bit. See, so something's breaking right here. You can see if current item quantity is greater than 0, our current item quantity is equal to 0. So the question is was my iron originally set up with 0? No. So something's gone wrong here. Okay, I see what's going on here. So basically, when we come in here, if I play this real quick and I run an ad, you can see here we're doing current item quantity is greater than 0. So current item quantity is greater than 0, so that's great. But then we're saying, hey, if current item quantity is greater than current item stack size, if not, then run through here and update our button and minus our current item minus our stack size. Now, while that might seem like it would work, what we're doing is we're adding in an empty item, right? Because we're minusing our quantity minus our stack size. Originally, the design was to say, hey, if you are adding something in, right? We didn't want to go over our actual stack size. But what we should be doing is we should be checking if it's equal to or less than or equal to our current item stack size. And that will fix our issue. So if we refresh this and we add, you can see that now we can add our items as expected. Now, the next big thing that we have to figure out is we don't actually have a craft menu, so we need to add that. So we're going to add a button down here. We're going to add that in. So I'm basically just going to come in here. I'm going to grab my remove. I'm going to control duplicate it. I'm going to pull this guy over, and I'm going to say open craft menu, and then I'm going to change this to open craft menu. I'm going to come into my node. I'm going to disconnect this method. I'm going to connect it. I will connect it to my inventory. Open craft menu button down. We're basically just going to do this exact same setup here. So we'll say var menu is equal to, and we'll need to instance our scene for our crafting menu. So if we scroll up here, we actually don't have a crafting menu scene here. So we'll add that in real quick. So var, and we'll make that into a packed scene like that. Then we'll scroll down to the bottom like so. Crafting menu scene dot instantiate, and then we'll basically just add child our menu. That. And that'll just give us a button that we can fire off. Now I'm going to need to hook this up. So we'll go into our inventory inspector. We have this guy here. So we'll find our crafting menu, which I believe I have right here. We'll drag this guy in. We will hit play. We'll open our crafting menu and we have a crash. Invalid set texture on base nil. Now, this is a weird one because it looks like Godot is kind of a little bit on the weird side. The ready function hasn't ran yet. This is an issue I ran into earlier with some other stuff. Apparently, Godot's ready function didn't run as soon as I instantiated it, and then when I did my update, it didn't get set up. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna grab my texture rect, and for my current icon, I'm going to paste these guys in, and then I'm gonna come in here, copy this guy, paste, paste, and paste, and then we're gonna try this again real quick. So we'll come in here, we'll open crafting menu. You see we got this one guy here, add item, add item. We're going to click this guy and nothing happens. Well, that's always a good sign. So let's take a look at our errors. It says, hey, attempted to call non-existent signal, to callable control crafting menu on button click. So that's interesting. So it says, hey, current craft button dot connect on button click. It doesn't exist. So our on button clicked exists. It has the 3 states. Our inventory button on it's on button click. If we look at our button, it's actually on button click, not clicked. It's not an ED, it's just clicked. So we'll copy that bad boy, put that in. Let's refresh it. Open craft menu, add item, click this guy, and it says non-existent function craft item on base resource. So, okay, so that means that this item does exist. So that's cool. We have the correct item. It's saying that craft item does not exist. So let's see if we look at our inventory button. We look at our item, craft items. I don't really like the idea of the name craft items. So let's go with craft item. Or what did we call it? We called it craft item. Okay, we'll just stick with craft item. I don't know why I called it craft items. I'm probably just going crazy. So let's try that. We'll drag this over, add, open craft menu, click. Non-existent function can afford in base control inventory. So let's see. Is our game manager, we take a look at our game manager, our inventory is set. So that exists. All that set up the way we would expect. So that's good news. But for some reason, it says can't afford in base control. So let's go look at our inventory. Can't afford item quantity. It's a lowercase c. That's a really poor naming choice. So I'm going to lowercase c it on my end, but I don't like that. I think that's really poor form. This should be a capital C, but for right now, we'll keep it as a lowercase c. I just don't like that at all. So we'll have to make that adjustment. But for right now, just to see if everything works, add, open craft menu, click, and we have our item. Awesome. Okay, so our crafting system's working. Now, first things first, I'm going to fix this can't afford. I'm going to make this a capital C. I do not like the can't afford without a capital C. That's just poor form on my part. So we'll say capital C. Let's take a look at our ad. I think our ad had a can't afford, or somebody had to have a can't afford somewhere. So we'll look to see if we can have a can't afford. If capital can't afford, there we go. That's a lot better. And let's see. Let's do a regression test real quick. Let's make sure that our inventory doesn't break. Okay, so if I just drag randomly, it blew up. So update item, grabbed current index 0, comma. We're going to need to add in a type. So we'll add in an inventory state of inventory because that's a draggable button. And that should solve that. Now I can drag like this and it's not going to affect anything. So that should be decent. I can still drag items, so that's good. I can still use my items. So you can see used item. Okay. And then I can open crafting menu. And I can't craft it. So something that we have to make sure we check for is if we take a look at this, we open up the craft menu, we can actually drag this button. We don't want to be able to do that because that can cause a lot of problems. So what we'll do is we'll come into our actual drag code here and we'll just check if our hovered button dot, and I believe our item button's going to have a state. So our inventory button actually has a current state. So we'll grab that real quick. Dot current state is equal to inventory button states dot craftable. And if it is, then we know that we can't do anything with this. So we're just going to return like that. And that should help with fixing that slight problem. So if we open crafting menu, we can still drag it. So that's not ideal. Let's see. Pretty sure that's the only place that really checks for drag. Let me actually do it right here. And does not equal dot states dot craftable. And that should fix that. Let's check. Open crafting menu, and there we go. Now I can add them. I can craft my item. I can use it, and we should be good. Now we need to actually hook up a small close button as well. So let's do that real quick. We'll come into our crafting menu here, and I'm going to grab my grid container. I'll pull it down just a tiny bit to give it a little bit of space. And I'm going to add in a button. I'm going to right upper align it like that. And we'll make it about this big, give or take. We'll just hit X. That way you can close it. And then I'm going to on button down that into my crafting menu, on button down. And my button down is just going to queue free like that. And there we go. That should be easy enough. So now add item, open crafting menu, close crafting menu. There we go. Easy enough. Hey guys, Editor Mitch here. So something that I forgot to set up was the labels. And I was running through the video and I went, oh my goodness, I forgot to actually set that up. So let's do that right now. So what we have to do is first we need to actually set up our label for a number. Now, if you remember, we have this label right here, but we need to actually set up a label for like the title of the object. Now, you could come in and make a pop-up menu, or you could come in and just have the name underneath it. It's completely up to you. And I think we might want to do more like a half and half kind of system here. So first thing, this label, let's just duplicate this guy and let's just grab our inventory button, drag this guy down here like this, grab our area 2D, do the exact same thing for our collision shape. That way we have our collision here. And let's grab our label 1, drag it up like this, and we'll get rid of the 1 so that way it's not there anymore. And we're going to go into our inventory button and we're going to get rid of our background here. So we'll go into our style, normal, and we'll make that empty so that way it's invisible. I'm going to right click, add in a panel like that, and that'll give us that background that we're looking for. The reason why I chose to go this route instead of just expanding it is because if the user clicks down here and it's not a button, then nothing's going to happen. And that little bit of separation there can cause a lot of problems. So that's why I have it set up this way. Now, label 2, I'm just going to call the name of item like that. And I'm going to left align it so that it's set up correctly. And then we could just put in test name. Now you can see with test name, it's way too big. So let's actually come in here and do an auto wrap based off of Word. Let's drag this guy down and we're going to have to make our button just slightly bigger because that's obviously not going to work. What we could do now that I'm thinking about is we can change the size of our font here. So let's come in here, change this to something like 10. That'll help with keeping it inside of a nice solid size. And this is something that you guys are probably going to have to play with, but we can adjust our button size to match as well. So we'll pull this down just a teeny tiny bit, and we'll drag our collision shape down just a tiny bit to match like that. We'll drag our name up just a tiny bit to match, and I think that will work. Now, once we have this, we basically need to set up our button to be hooked up properly. So if we go into our button code, right down here, we actually set up our button right here in our update item. So we can just come in here and say, okay, $ name of item dot text is equal to empty. Copy this guy, paste it, tab them in, and then down here we can basically just paste it, tab it in, do item dot name like that, and that'll pull out our name, and that basically does it for us. So now if we just go into our inventory, we hit play, you can see we have some words here. That's okay, it's not a big deal, we'll fix that in a second. If we add an item, you'll see it says iron, and it's way up there. So there's some issues with how our inventory is being set up. I think it's spacing, though I will need to look. So let's take a look at our inventory here, and let's drag in a couple of inventory buttons and see how this reacts. So we'll drag this guy in. We will duplicate it a few times, and you'll see we have some overlap. Now, the reason why the overlap exists is because in our grid container, we have our layout container sizing, and it looks like we have expand and fill, but it doesn't seem to do quite what I'm looking for. We have some H separation and some V separation, but I don't think that's going to cause what we're trying to do here. So let me take a look at our inventory button. Is there something I am missing here? Custom mini size, that's what's going on. So we need to make this the proper size. So if we look at our transform, it is 74. We're going to make that 80 just because it's an easy number to work with. It's a multiple of the 40. So we could just set that to 80 and adjust our collision shape to match. There we go. And now if we go to our inventory, that should work. So now we can come in here, get rid of this. Yes. And then hit play. So if we hit play, you can see here's our buttons. So if we add an item, you'll notice that our icon is way too big. So let's take a look at our inventory button. Take a look at our texture rect. My guess is our texture rect is set to be full size. So we'll make that a little bit smaller, something like that, and that should solve that problem. If we refresh this, we added an item. There we go. Our label is off, probably because we moved our stuff down. So let's drag this guy back up so it's in the correct spot. There we go. That's much better. That's more like what we're looking for. Now, something that we have to keep in mind is when we open up our crafting menu, this works great, but we need to tell them, hey, like this is what our object requires. So let's do a on hover to basically make it so it can tell you what it requires, because a lot of good it's going to do us if we can't actually tell you like what this requires to exist. So if we hit play, you can see here's our buttons. So if we add an item, you'll notice that our icon is way too big. So let's take a look at our inventory button. Take a look at our texture rect. My guess is our texture rect is set to be full size. So we'll make that a little bit smaller, something like that, and that should solve that problem. If we refresh this, we added an item. There we go. Our label is off, probably because we moved our stuff down. So let's drag this guy back up so it's in the correct spot. There we go. That's much better. That's more like what we're looking for. Now, something that we have to keep in mind is when we open up our crafting menu, this works great, but we need to tell them, hey, like this is what our object requires. So let's do a on hover to basically make it so it can tell you what it requires, because a lot of good it's going to do us if we can't actually tell you like what this requires to exist. So in order to do a hover over menu, we're going to first need to make that menu. So I'm going to right click, add a child node. I'm going to add in a control node, And I'm going to make it, I don't know how big just yet, so I'll just make it, you know, maybe this big. I'm going to right click, add a child node. We're going to add in a panel. We're going to make that a full rect panel like that. We're going to right click, add in another child node. Let's add in a label like that. And this will be the actual header label. So we'll drag this guy all the way across. And we'll just say name text for right now. That'll give us something to work with, at least temporarily. And we will call this header title. We'll control C, control V. We'll control duplicate that a few times. Let's drag this guy down here and let's just say wait. Let's drag this guy down, put it over here, and put a small number, something like 10. And we will horizontally align it to the right. We can drag this guy down and say components. We'll rename this to weight value. We'll rename this to weight title. And then we'll rename this to components title. And then let's right click our control node, add in a child node, add in a list, add in a VBox container. We'll snap this to the lower bottom and we'll pull this guy up like this. Right click, add in a child node, and then let's add in a HBox container. Let's right click, add in a child node, and let's add in a label like that. Let's say test, and then let's duplicate this guy and say 10. Now we're going to need to come in here and change the layout to be fill and expand on horizontal, which it doesn't look like it's expanding properly. So let's click on our label and then do under layout. Let's tell it to expand all the way. And that'll help keep these guys down here like this. And then that basically gives us the ability to just duplicate this multiple times and it should just work. Now we'll need to expand this panel just a little bit. I want to give this a bit more breathing room. So let's pull our components down like that. And let's pull our weight down like that as well. We're going to grab this, move it over just a tiny bit, give it a little bit of that buffer that we're looking for. And we should be good. Now we're going to grab this guy and we're going to need to actually set it up. So this is going to be a component list element like that. And I'm going to right click, attach a script to it, call it a component list element, create. And we're going to right click and save branch as seen as a component list, which I spelled horrible, by the way. Let's fix that. We'll call it component list element. And then I have a script right here, so I'll just rename that real quick. As well. There we go. So I'm going to rename both of these guys, and then I'm going to re-drag this guy up here. I'm going to name this as name, and then I'm going to set this as value. And then we're going to click on this guy. We're going to come in here and say func set up name comma value, and then basically we'll just say $name dot text is equal to name, and then $value dot text is equal to str value, like that. And that'll basically set us up and get us ready to go. Now we also need to right click this guy and make it into a scene. So we're going to save branch as scene, and we're going to save this as a component list element. Like that. And that will give us a scene to work with. Now I can delete this guy And then we can come up to our control node. We'll right click this, rename it and call it inventory pop-up menu. And then we're going to right click that and create a script. We're going to call it inventory pop-up menu.gd. And basically we're going to do the same thing that we did with our component. We'll say func setup inventory pop-up menu. We're going to take in a header, comma, we're going to take in a weight value, and we're going to take in a list of components. So we'll say maybe makeup components like that. And actually we don't want the capital M, so we'll go with the lowercase m. Now what we'll do is we'll hit $ header title dot text is equal to header $ weight value dot text is equal to weight value, and we'll need to cast that as a string just because we aren't sure if it's going to be correct. Now with this one, this next section here, if we take a look at our makeup components, this is going to be a dictionary, right? So this is going to be the items that make up our actual stuff. So if we take a look at our item, we have an item craftable makeup. And that's basically what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing we did with our can of Ford. We're going to pass in an item. And we're going to pass in our item craftable makeup. So that means we have to do this, basically this for each loop right here. So we can come into our script here. We'll just say for item in makeup components, and we'll have to work with our items. Now, how this is going to work is we're going to instance in one of our components. If you remember, we have our component list element, which I believe is down here. So we need to make a packed scene for that. So var component list element scene as a packed, and we can just export that guy out like that. And that will give us something that we can just drag in when we select our inventory pop-up menu. But first, before we do that, we need to actually set up our item. So we'll say var component element is equal to component list element scene dot instance like that. So we instantiate it. And then we can say component element dot setup. And I believe that we called it setup component. So we can grab that and copy it. We can come back here, setup component, and we need to pass in two elements. We have our name and our value. So our name is going to be our item dot name, comma, make up components, and we'll pass in our item. And in theory, that should just work. I hope. So we'll see how that goes. Now we do need to set up our inventory pop-up menu. So that's going to have to come in with our inventory. So we need to go all the way back up to our inventory here. We'll come down here, and where we do our hover over, I believe it's under input. Hover over button does not equal null. We may want to make it so that hover over button shows up only if it's a craftable item, right? So we need to actually pull this guy out, and we're going to need to do a lot more fancy logic here. So if this is not null, right? If hovered button is a inventory button, do this. If hovered button dot current state does not equal inventory button dot inventory button states dot craftable, then do this bit of code here. If it does, then we know it's a craftable inventory button, so we can actually set up our pop-up. So $ inventory pop-up menu dot show like that, and then $ inventory pop-up menu dot, and I believe we had a script called setup inventory pop-up menu. So let's pass that in. And we'll need to get our hovered button dot item dot current item dot, and I believe that would be name, comma. We need to get our weight value. So covered button dot current item dot. If I take a look at my item, it's going to be weight, comma, covered button dot current item dot item craftable makeup. And in theory, that should work. Although now that I'm thinking about it, I wonder if we should change this to just take an item. I think that'll be a better option. Let's do that. Let's do this like so. And then let's go to our inventory pop-up. And instead of doing this, let's just take a item, a current item. We'll make that a type item. And then that'll give us item.name like this, current item dot weight, and then current item dot item craftable makeup. And that'll give me a lot more and that'll give me a much more simpler system, because then I'm not messing around with having things be funky or having things be weird. We can just basically use this. Now, I actually think that this is going to require for each item and item craftable makeup. I don't want to pass this in. I want to pass in an item instead, like that. Or no, actually, I think that would be correct. Yeah, that would be right. So that should work. And we'll come down here, click on our inventory pop-up menu. Let's drag our component list in here. Let's hit play. And if we click on open crafting menu, we hover over this, you can see it says key weight components, iron and coal, which is perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. Now we do need this object to follow our mouse. So what we need to do is basically, we have a lot of options here, right? We could drag it as a part of our mouse area, but then we're going to have to come in and change our inventory pop-up menu settings, these guys here, to handle the new mouse area. And I think that might be our best bet. So I'm going to drag this guy up and drop it in here. And then I'll just add in mouse area slash, and then I'll just copy this guy like this. Paste and paste. And I think that's all of them. So we'll refresh it. You'll see now it follows our mouse as expected. If we open our crafting menu, it now pops up. But you'll notice that it is behind our crafting menu here. So we should probably click on our inventory pop-up menu, click on our inventory pop-up menu, come to visibility, or perhaps ordering, change our Z index up 1, and then see how that works. You can see it's now following our mouse. We'll open our crafting menu, we'll hover over, it says key, weight is 0, components is 1 iron and 1 coal. We can go off, go back on, and it works as expected. Awesome. So now all I really want to do is go into my crafting menu real quick and give it a title. So we'll drop in a label, drag this over, make it slightly bigger, and call it crafting menu. And we will align this center. There we go. And I think, hey guys, Editor Mitch here. So I found a bug. So if you go into your inventory here, and you add an item, you add another item, and you add another item. So we have 2 of each, iron and coal. And then you open your crafting menu, you hit key, it gets rid of all 4 items. It should only get rid of 2, right? It should only get rid of 1 of each, not all 4. Now the reason why this is happening is because we're actually subtracting our current item quantity right here under our remove. So on line 159, if we just change this to quantity, and then we change this to quantity, like that, and we save it, we hit play, and we add an item, add an item, add an item, add an item. We open our craft menu, we hit key. You see we only take out the 2, and then if I hit one more, you'll see that this, it's really hard to see, but it says 2. So I just want to make sure I covered that, so that way you guys aren't hitting this issue and then confused as to why it's broken. So that's all I have for you guys today. So if you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. Hey, you know, if you dislike this video, go ahead and hit that dislike button, because I'm here to make content for you guys, and that is how I know if I'm doing a good job. So it's always important to know how good a video does so that I can make good content in the future. And this video, as with all of my videos, was a viewer suggested video. So if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below, or jump on my GitHub. I have a link to it in the description below, where you can actually just throw in an issue and it will be tracked on my board. I decided to go that route because I figured it was going to be a bit easier than me just tracking via your guys' comments. So if you guys feel like it, you're welcome to use that as well. And hey, if you guys have any issues or any feedback, go ahead and leave it in the comments below, or jump on my Discord. The link is in the description, and I'll be more than happy to help you out with any issues you might be having. But that is all I have for you guys today. So thank you so much again for watching. I'll see you all next time. Thanks.